est absolument ravi d'accueillir Raïm Fortune. Nous le recevons aujourd'hui pour son deuxième ouvrage qui s'appelle Hardtack, qui est également publié par l'excellente maison d'édition Loose Joints, qui fait vraiment, je trouve, un travail absolument remarquable dans le domaine de l'édition du livre de photographie. Et je cède la parole à Raïm sans plus attendre. Raïm, the floor is yours.
So I will start with the kind of choices around the book. You know, this was my second book with Loose Joints, so a very close working collaboration. The first book, I Can't Stand to See You Cry, published in 2021, observed my family in about 6 years of photographs in a central Texas town where I grew up. And so following that work, I was interested in continuing this idea of family and kind of continuity of community, place, and its relationship to history. In particular, in a Black American context, I was raised by, you know, quite an older family, my father being born in the 50s, and so my grandparents being children of the 30s. I kind of grew up in this context of a history before myself, and so that kind of set the landscape and the grounds for the work that I would continue to do. And so with the first book, as I said, it was a bit more of an introspective and autobiographical approach on photography. So in this book, I was more interested in kind of looking out towards communities and you know, other families that were not my own, but who I felt connected to and grounded to, especially after the passing of both of my parents. I felt that finding this community outwardly was something important and kind of an act of self-preservation, communal preservation. So the title Hardtack, it draws itself from a Civil War era food that was comprised of a few key ingredients, just water, salt, and flour. And it was affiliated with what were known as the Buffalo Soldiers, which were the 11th Cavalry of the American military, which were an all-Black military group kind of founded right at the time of emancipation. And the Buffalo Soldiers would lean heavily on the skills that were picked up as Black cowboys and ranchers, and often a lot of Black Texans would work as cowboys because there was a kind of freedom that was found in the open trail that was not found in city life and in social life at the time. And so hardtack was a food that was eaten, and so I kind of used this metaphor of this food that had an extremely long shelf life and is connected to post-colonial Texas in the context of Black Americans as a metaphor for longevity and sustenance. The choice to have no photograph on the book, that was proposed by the designers, Sarah and Lewis, the brilliant couple who run Loose Joints. And you know, at first I thought it would be nice to have maybe a tipped-in photograph, but Lewis kind of explained to me this confidence that to have no photograph on the book and to say, open it up, the photos are on the inside. The material that we used is a recycled fabric comprised of cotton and denim. And so again, you know, with the history of, you know, Levi Strauss and, you know, jeans as indicator of labor and, you know, kind of working people, it felt like an obvious choice to use this new material that was available. So let me go ahead and get into it. So what I'll do is I'll go through the book and I'll kind of point out a few decisions with sequencing and storytelling, and then we'll go back and I can kind of point out a few parallels. So we open up with this photograph of a home and a windmill in a town called Hutto, Texas. And to me, this photograph harkens back to a photographer who I really admire. His name is Arthur Rothenstein, and he was the student of Roy Stryker. Roy Stryker was the founder of the FSA, the Farm Security Administration, a group of typists or photographers who would survey the American landscape for a few decades after the Great New Deal, creating what would kind of be characterized as kind of post-Great Depression American photography. And, you know, there's a bit of kind of mixed feelings about the FSA and their practice. Was it propaganda? Was it not propaganda? Was it kind of virtue signaling to a larger kind of democratic agenda in the country of resettlement? But more or less the photographs of Walker Evans, Dorothea Lange, Arthur Rothenstein, Russell Lee would kind of become to characterize what we know of rural America So this photograph to me kind of, you know, plays back on an image you would have seen after the Dust Bowl, when a lot of Oklahoma and Texas residents had to leave their homes after a Dust Bowl. So you would see these photographs in the archive of homes that had been vacated that looked to be more or less in great shape, but there was a kind of underlying reality of economic disparity, land migration, in a more or less a changing time, which in this book I kind of find as something that is the only thing we, you know, that is constant, is change. And so kind of observing this way that communities shift and migrate as time passes. I'll try to keep it shorter on the next few photos, but so the book starts off with a photograph made in a town called Edna, Texas, in South Texas. It's a small kind of subsidiary community of Houston. And in this photograph, you see a woman in the front who is grown up in the church here in Edna, Texas. She's participating in a tradition called praise dancing, which is just a form of kind of, you know, dance and praise that's done to music and is also associated with gospel music. And she's teaching two younger women this tradition. And I kind of, in the sequence, we kind of use this image as like opening up the book. They're kind of setting, you know, kind of a blessing over the sequence and for the people who are about to come. This next photograph is also taken in Edna, Texas, and it is a George Washington Carver School that was demolished against the community's wishes. And so there's kind of a theme in this book of honoring the communities in which I photograph in the Black communities around the Texas and in the kind of larger South, but also observing how maybe they've been a bit discarded by our politicians and, you know, government institutions. A lot of these facilities should have been preserved and archived and held for people to learn from, because I think it's kind of the old adage of, if you don't know where you've been, you don't know where you're going. And so I think that it is actually extremely important for us to honor these spaces. And so this was a school that was demolished against the community's wishes, and the woman in the previous photograph had actually attended this school. The next image, Lawrence L-Dog, he's a rodeo cowboy in Texas, and so for many years I would return to this small regional rodeo that takes place in East Texas, Mississippi, and Louisiana, and I would befriend the cowboys and photograph them and also just kind of enjoy the time. There was a handful of events that I would do that year after year, and it would be my way of making photographs, meeting people, and kind of, you know, finding more or less my next photograph. And what I really loved about this photo is, you know, the textural elements of his belt buckle, which indicates that he was a champion in '02, kind of showing that his time as champion is 2 decades before us. The textures of his hat and the grills that he wears, you know, the gold teeth, is just really, it expresses a lot about the Texas culture, but also just him as an individual. And I also love that this moment was taken during the national anthem, so you kind of return to this theme of prayer or reverence. This next two pairings, you know, and so I guess another thing, this book, we try to be quite traditional in the design and the design choices of the sequence. So you find a few double page spreads, but quite often it is right-weighted photographs. And so it's, you know, kind of a very classic approach to design and meant to give the photographs kind of space to breathe and allow for the kind of poetic nature of the sequence to really be considered by the viewer. And so you're not really imposed with like a lot of double spreads with full bleed images, and it's kind of meant to be like its own gallery space for the viewer. And that's something that I really like, because as you know, as hard as we work to make galleries and museums accessible to all, I really love that books are something that you can enjoy at home and kind of spend time with without the kind of pressures of the art world or high society kind of telling you what to think. And so I've always loved photo books for that. You can really unpack art in your own home with a cup of tea or some music. And so this photograph here is of my good friend Chase. These are his 2 daughters. And Chase had a really incredible redemption story. You know, he had served some time, and when I met him, he really cared about doing something for the neighborhood that he had in his youth kind of caused harm within, being in the streets. And so meeting him was really incredible. He always wanted to do a Netflix documentary, but he settled on just my black and white photographs, and we would work to understand the places that I was photographing. And this picture of his 2 daughters playing in this dirt field in the morning before church in their white dresses kind of show a bit of the fragile nature of the neighborhood and of all of us in a way. You know, a couple of wrong moves and these dresses are going to be pretty dirty. And so I've always really loved this image of them. You know, I would photograph along the routes of a lot of the historical parades, in particular the Juneteenth parades. Juneteenth is a Black American celebration of emancipation in one of the southernmost towns called Galveston, Texas. And so the enslaved people were freed maybe 3 months after the rest of the country because the word hadn't made it there. And so when the final people were freed in South Texas, this day, June 19th, was dawned Juneteenth and has been a celebration of freedom in Texas, which, you know, you find parallels to Juve, you find parallels to, you know, Carnival and Caribbean culture. And so there's kind of multiple Black celebrations for freedom. And Juneteenth is now been recognized as a federal holiday thanks to a woman named Opal Lee, who is a Texas resident. And so these porches that now are unoccupied, these homes are boarded up. You know, a lot of conversations have been presented, in particular with the parades, around should they be moved, because a lot of the neighborhoods have been so heavily gentrified that the Black residents actually do not occupy these neighborhoods anymore. So we have to travel in actually just to have the celebrations in the neighborhoods where we used to own. And this next image is a photograph of a good friend of mine named Evan. And it's a reference to a photograph from a photographer named Ernst Haas, who photographed in Alabama. And this kind of vignette, and like I said, a return to like photo history and a dialogue with the past in the ways in which we've seen the South photographed before, so that there is a kind of commonality and a language in which we can continue that conversation. We're not starting at square one with visual language. And so that's something that I will often play with in my work, and also this mix of photographing strangers, photographing my friends. And I always return to the quote of Walker Evans where he says, "There's no such thing as a documentary photograph, but only documentary style." And so that's something that if I'm making just a portrait of a friend, it may seem like this, you know, it kind of blurs the line between intimate and public. Another double spread, which I really enjoy, it's two brothers on the right at the Juneteenth parade in a home in 2nd Ward, Houston. And this house is one of the only homes in this ward that looks like this. And again, I'm not sure how long it will be there. And so it's kind of a return to this idea of the history that we're kind of constantly surrounded with, and with these photographs maybe posing a question of positionality and where do we stand within this history. And so in this next sequence, you know, within the book, there's a few chapters. In each kind of sequence, we kind of pose maybe a set of questions. And I kind of like to work in that way where I start with a set of questions rather than an answer that I'm hoping to prove with the photographs. And so in this series of images, you see a grandmother's hands. The next image is of her granddaughter, and her name is Soraya, which through the research in the book I've learned translates to Princess of God, which was so fitting of this book and of, you know, tradition and praise and you know, this kind of folk history and religion. I found that Soraya was such a beautiful name and so fitting for this photograph. And you know, this photograph was made about 4 years ago when she was a freshman in high school, and she's now graduated, and she was really, really happy to have her photo be in the book. And in this next image, it's taken in a AME church, which is an African Methodist Episcopal church. There's kind of a distinction of these two denominations in Texas. There's AME and UME. AME is the kind of solely Black denomination of these churches, where UME, they kind of, you know, united with the other Methodist churches. So the AME churches are very important. And I guess the kind of context within the importance of the churches with the photographs is that through the civil rights movements and also in the time of segregation, the churches served for a place of fraternity, also for communities to come together, also was a huge place of political agency. So a lot of political groups and fundraising for different political goals was done through the church. So it was always kind of a building block for Black communities in Texas. And so with my interest in photographing these historic churches was to, more or less observe their current status. And in this image you see at the bottom here an attendance board that is, most likely some decades old. And so with these, photographs of the young woman and we go into the church, I'm kind of posing this question of, are the young people participating in the traditions? A lot of these churches you go to are only older people. And so, like I said, rather than kind of telling you an answer of what you should feel or what it is that you should think, it's kind of just offering some context and leaving it open to the viewer. And another key element of this photograph is the use of portraiture within this frame. This image of Richard Allen, who was a Philadelphia poet and kind of considered one of the early Black American geniuses and kind of like a pillar of Black excellence and what was possible for Black Americans to achieve, as well as these images of two of the founders of the church. And so with this book, I've always been interested in the ways in which photography was utilized by Black Americans, Black Texans, as a means of self-fashioning and self-creation in the wake of, a lot of horrible stereotypes in a prejudiced society. And so photography was always used as a way of counteracting that and to really say, well, aren't we something? And I always, kind of note that it is no mistake that Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass were the most photographed people of their time. We're going into another home. This is like a neoclassical kind of colonial style house in a town called Taylor, Texas. These images that will repeat throughout the book of the road kind of both serve as, a totem of how land is politicized, both in ownership and through industry, but also kind of remark on my journey of choosing to make these photographs and traveling out and the kind of intention of going out and seeking out these photographs. And when I made this image in particular, I got completely covered in stickers from the grass. I'm pretty sure those shoes are still ruined, but it's always nice when the photo works out. And this one is, a clear kind of reference to Robert Adams or Louis Baltz and this kind of deadpan, melancholy view on landscape and a minimalist view of landscape, which is a big inspiration. The next image here is of a mother and her two daughters at the Juneteenth parade. I've always really loved the way their eyes kind of repeat in their shape and gaze towards the camera. And so, you really can kind of consider the way in which generations are participating in these events, and what will these generations look like by the time that she is her mother's age, and so on. This is taken in a town called El Campo, and so kind of just a quiet moment to allow for the sequence to breathe. That's a big kind of a negotiation with making these sequences, is that you have quiet moments to lead you up to, the portraits or just things where it can't just really be, crescendo after crescendo. You need time for calm and to breathe. In this portrait I'll return to, I photographed a father and son in this town, El Campo, and they had a bit of, a troubled relationship that they were working to mend, which I don't think is a unique story in any way. It's a very universal tale of conflicts with parents or conflicts with self, and so that was something also that I was interested in. This photograph is in North Houston, Texas. A lot of my work references back to music, in particular kind of soul music and Motown era music, and so a lot of that music was popularized by lowrider culture, and so the Cars are very important. And also automobiles are another central theme to the book because of the history of American photography and its relationship to the road trip. So this next sequence is a personal favorite of mine. And an issue with making, not an issue more so, but a concern with making this work was to not repeat stereotype or trope within this book, kind of looking back at the American South. It is such a heavily photographed place, so many incredible photographs made from the, infancy of the medium till contemporary. And so I wanted to be careful of not kind of reiterating our past notions and ideations of the South, So when dealing with, you know, the churches or the rodeos, I wanted to be very careful of not, like I said, leading the viewer down one particular path that was reductive of nuance or complexity. And I feel like in this sequence that we are able to negotiate some of the church photos in a very interesting way, because you start with this first photograph that is made at a hair show in Atlanta, Georgia in 2019. And you see the kind of lights where the women are getting ready, these small bottles for hairspray and a face spray. And in this next image, you have this kind of repeating theme of the light fixture, as well as a hand sanitizer and a holy water, which is very telling of a kind of post-2020 society. And it is paired on the right with an image of a Prince Hall Freemason, which is a very old fraternity group in Texas, kind of founded by freedmen who were not allowed into other Freemason societies, and they play a major role in a lot of funding and education, but also a lot of what they do is also very secretive. And so with this sequence between going from this hair show to the historic church and to the Freemason, I feel like you're not really leading the viewer down one particular, you know, path of what they should be thinking or reading the images as. It really leaves a kind of freedom in an outside view of looking at the connectedness of the self-expression and, as I said, the self-fashioning within these images. This next photograph was made in 2023 in Atlanta, Georgia at a friend's wedding. He commissioned me to do his wedding photos, and crazy enough, I took it on. Photographing a wedding is very, you know, stressful at times, but I knew that it was going to be a beautiful ceremony and that there was potential to get a photograph for my own artistic practice. And so this photo is titled Flower Girl, and, you know, the use of flash, I'm kind of trying to play again on vernacular photography, or, you know, a few other photographers who I draw kind of a lot of inspiration from. If it's someone like Eva Lippman and Ken Graves, who use the heavy use of flash, or Russell Lee, as I said, who was a major influence on my work. This church is one of the oldest black churches in Texas. It sits vacant now. And so in this sequence, I was really interested in these kind of marquee indicators of Southern photography. When you think of kind of from a purist standpoint, there's like these things that we're used to seeing, and they're kind of like classics. They feel good when you see them. And so one of these things was this idea of withering paint. If you look at the Walker Evans, Alabama photos, there is these kind of weathering clapboards, and it's a texture just as familiar as, you know, the photographs that we grew up seeing of the South. And, you know, I think that, you know, I think it's Evans who said that photography in its essence is just a description of surfaces. And so another thing that I was interested in is the kind of the rendering of black skin by the silver gelatin print. And so again, you have these weathering clapboards from a house, and you have this kind of silver glow of the face. But what I really love about these photographs is they're not describing any kind of hardship or, you know, oppression, in which is often paired with when you see images of the weathering homes and of the portraits. I mean, I think of, you know, countless photographers, not to throw anyone under the bus, but this kind of constant use of black folks in the South as something to point to, to maybe feel sorry for, or to look how exotic. But this photograph is just solely about just the beauty of this young woman in the photograph, her dress, and her friend who is near her. And so I kind of, not to say using the tools of documentary photography and the history against itself, but that is kind of something that maybe we can point to the archive and, you know, rethink, you know, what it is that we love so much about some of these classic works. This photograph shows a grandmother after church in front of her home in Houston, Texas. This image is kind of a juxtaposition with this image. So you see her hands, and later on in the sequence, you are revealed her from a wider perspective. This photograph shows a business in Austin, Texas. It's one of the only black businesses left in what is known as 6 Square, which is a 6 square mile district of Austin that was designated for black businesses. And they've been offered you know, I think the latest offer was $4 million for this lot, and kind of as an act of resistance, they've denied all these offers and continue to just serve great food and just hang out. And so Sam's Barbecue, I also learned that Sam himself has like 30 grandchildren, and so if you run into a lot of folks, like they're gonna be like, oh, that's my granddad. So, and so I'm super interested in this kind of generations passing, and this image as well was taken in Alabama. The image here on the left is of a gas pump in Selma, Alabama, where the, you know, freedom marches of Martin Luther King and John Lewis happened. And on the right, you have a portrait of a father with his young child. And I was in Alabama photographing a group of quilters known as the Gee's Bend Quilters. They're a group of women off of the Alabama River who have been making quilts since the 1800s, and the quilts have kind of now been adorned by the art world. They've had international exhibitions, and so they're like some true Southern artists who just living off the beaten path of Alabama, making quilts, and it was so great to go stay with them. And when I was photographing, there's no hotels around, so I had to literally like stay over like at the house, and like they like ask you like, all right, what do you want to eat while you're here? And I'm like, I'll take some catfish and some, you know, some red beans, whatever you got. And so it was very endearing, you know. I'm letting the kids play with the cameras, and you were just, you know, it was really incredible. And so also the author who wrote for this book, she's an Alabama native, so it was great to have some photographs from Alabama. And again, this photograph kind of, like I said, harkens back to the American road trip and kind of maybe my own lack of hope within that form of making photographs, of just driving around the country and finding people for ethical reasons or otherwise. So these next two photographs are kind of another, you know, maybe diptych. The first, we start with this fence that is surrounded by flowers. Obvious metaphor there for fences and kind of land designation. This side versus that side is, you know, not to overly unpack it, but I think there's something there about this kind of, you know, fence that has also been overtaken back by nature. There's only so much that it can impose. And the next image is of a young man, and his body kind of mirrors that same composition. And one of the things that I really loved about this photo, his name's Deontay, he's a close friend of mine in Texas, is that he has these 3 dates tattooed on him. One being 1947 on his chest, 1968, and 2017. And so with his tattoos, again, this kind of form of self-designation or self-expression, he's chosen these dates that are either for past loved ones, or I learned that 2017 was the year that he turned his life around. And so I think that these tattoos kind of show a proximity to a particular generation. You know, we are a generation who is fixated within maybe having a relative in 1947 and also having a kind of coming of age in 2017. And so, you know, in the contemporary, that might seem normal, but I just think about how this photo will age and how that detail of it will always kind of resonate with me. And in this next image, we have a building in a town called Granger, Texas, very close to where the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre was filmed, if anyone is familiar with the kind of classic American film. But I was also interested in this building and the kind of leftover painted signs. And so kind of similar to, you know, a fading tattoo, the fading signs. And so this idea that, you know, history, we literally wear history on our bodies through characterization, through looks, and similarly with these classic brick buildings in Texas. This photograph was taken in Houston, Texas, in McGregor Park. And I've always loved this image from just this kind of classic, her look to the camera, the bandana, her friend who's sitting on the convertible top in the back, the Cadillac logos. There was so much that I really loved about this photograph. And again, the use of the vehicle. It's also, to me, it's in conversation with a photograph from the first book, which also shows a young man in his vehicle. And so these kind of street portraits I always love because I find so much beauty in the people that I photograph. And she, you know, to me, and similarly to the photograph from the first book, could be, you know, casted, signed model, but they're just in the park, you know, hanging out and enjoying themselves. This next image was made in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in Greenwood in particular. And so there was a time in American history known as urban renewal, where the country was looking to revamp a lot of neighborhoods that were considered less desirable. This is kind of the way in which it was framed by the government. And so they would often build highways through communities as a way of displacing people through eminent domain. And so this highway was built through a community that had already suffered the Greenwood Massacre in, I believe, 1919, when white Oklahomans literally used World War I planes and bombed black residents and completely dismantled what was known as Black Wall Street. And so this is where that happened. And I was there on assignment for New York Times Magazine and made this photograph. And I guess an interesting choice from the editor, who I have so much admiration for, she kind of posed this question of there was two frames, one with the person and one without the person walking, and how this man here still rendering this space as to and from work, home, really shows an important use of space, and that, you know, even though they had built this highway through, you know, people were still using this, using the space. And so this photograph, as I said, is, let's see, is a response to, let me just take a look. To this photograph. So this, as I said, are father and son. And, you know, when I met them, they were kind of in the process of repairing the relationship. And so I really love the kind of tension that kind of comes through in these photographs, because, you know, they're still getting comfortable with one another and also having their photograph made. So it was kind of fun to, like, you know, be there to help them kind of become vulnerable with one another, and having your photo made is a quite vulnerable thing. You know, having someone render your likeness to their imagination is not something that I personally take lightly. It's just a simple snapshot. You know, I think there's an immense amount of trust in allowing a photographer to make your portrait. And so I've always loved these two photographs. And yes, this was made in, I believe, 2020. Again, we return to the road, this kind of, you know, simple metaphor of my travels and time past. This image shows a mother and daughter in Houston, Texas. And these two images are kind of in conversation with each other. These are a set of railroad tracks in a town called Archer, Florida, near what was formerly known as Rosewood, Florida, which was another town that kind of suffered a vicious attack from the Klan in 1923 on New Year's Day, where 2,000 plus Klans members ascended on this town and kind of systematically burnt the town down over a period of 7 days. There was literally a Presbyterian church nearby where the Klan was like refilling. It was like a summer camp for them. It was such a sick historical event. And not everybody at this time was as violently racist as the people who committed this atrocity. There were people who were advocates for the black community there, and they would ride a steam train through the night, known as what was known as the night rides, and they would collect residents of the town to save them from this attack that was carried out over 7 days. So these train tracks are the original tracks in nearby Archer, Florida, where the night rides happened. But one of the kind of things about that story was that they would only pick up women and children because it was just too dangerous to pick up men at the time, because there was literally kind of an active war happening between them. And so this idea of the kind of assault on the male figure in the home was kind of a repeated thing throughout Black American history, from mass incarceration to the war on drugs, and through kind of multiple generations of an absence of a male figure. And so without being too heavy-handed, we kind of wanted to subtly kind of nod to this, you know, history. And, you know, I always think of, you know, Robert Adams saying, like, if I was going to like explain the pictures, like, you know, I wouldn't have made them. So it's, you know, best left to metaphor and to, you know, reading. But since you guys are here with me, I'll share some of these stories. This next image is of my lovely girlfriend, Miranda, who's been by my side for 5 years. And she appears on the cover of I Can't Stand to See You Cry, and also in Portraits in that book. And so, convinced her to let me use one more picture of her for this book, which I'm very grateful for. And this is kind of takes, you know, this was a photo kind of made in that same time of I Can't Stand to See You Cry, when I was dealing with the loss of my father and kind of, you know, coming into the craziness of the art world and photography. And so this is a very special portrait. And in this next image you see, and there's another image that touches on this as well. I was kind of subtly interested in the climate change that was happening in Texas. The climate has changed so much to extremes, from extreme heat to also in 2021 we experienced a massive freeze, which we lost a lot of residents because Texas doesn't have the infrastructure to handle the freeze. And so the kind of funny story of this one is that there was a lot of like journalists out making work during the freeze, and I seeing it and I'm like, oh man, should probably make a picture right now. So I just walked outside and photographed the lantern outside of my garage, and it worked out. So, you know, had a good ratio for the freeze. But it kind of comes into this idea of the domestic. I really do love that this was made in our home. This photograph is of our home. And in the next image you see Tiny Petway, who's the oldest living Gee's Bend quilters, and you see her hands on top of one of her quilts. And so kind of visually it kind of brings you back into the warmth of the home. And so really love that kind of sequencing. This next image shows a VCR with a lot of VHS tapes inside of a garage. And so often in Texas, people will have kind of an open garage where they hang out and, you know, they smoke cigarettes and maybe play some guitar and just kind of just hang out, especially during the summer. It's like a resting place. But I also love this kind of idea that some of these VHS tapes, from Gummo to Aliens, this Western film, Teenage Ninja Turtles, it kind of also shows like pop culture and a reference point for kind of Americana. So I love this image. This next photograph, titled Smoking Cowboy in Cheek, Texas, taken in 2023, shows a cowboy. He's one of the Wilson brothers. There's two brothers in Texas who are like really well-known black rodeo bull riders in the kind of underground circuit. They're like local celebrities. And so right around dusk, I made this photograph of him as he's lacing up his chaps and getting ready to get on a wild animal. So I try not to get into their headspace too much because these guys are literally about to get onto like a raging bull. So I'm not gonna like bother them too much for my pictures. And so I try to, you know, kind of hang out, look tough enough to be around and not like stick out too much. And, you know, shot this like waist level with a Rolleiflex and a flash for all my nerds out there. But I always love this picture. His floral shirt and the smoke coming from his cigarette is just lovely. The next image is taken in Longview, Texas, at a rodeo, the Juneteenth rodeo. It's kind of an exception. It's maybe the only night photograph, also one of the few photographs made with a long lens. And I just really love the kind of casual nature, the way they're very unaware of the camera, and just kind of naturally you see their gestures and, you know, various expressions after a long night of rodeoing, which is like a pretty high adrenaline filled event. So when these photographs were first proposed to me, it was very jarring. And I guess for photographers in the audience, if you're working with an editor, sometimes those reactions are good. When you see something that is so outside of what you would have done yourself, can actually be really great from collaboration, because it gets you out of this safe nature of maybe what you want your photographs to be. Often we're making photographs in yearning for maybe a certain reference point or something that we really enjoy, but I think there's an honesty to what your photos actually do and what they're actually saying. And so I believe deeply in a trusted collaboration to be able to work with someone who understands your viewpoint, but can also show you maybe things that you're too close to see within your work. And so I'm really happy that we included these two still lifes. They kind of serve as kind of a middle point of the book, but also kind of as like a chapter break. You have the still life of the antique iron, and so the iron for me becomes a metaphor for the pressing of clothing, something that you see a lot with the rodeos and also within the churches. And you also have the spur here. These objects were also both included as kind of installation in my exhibition in Arles in 2022. So it's also kind of a, like, you know, foreshadowing that was, if you saw that show, people might recognize these objects from being in the exhibition. And then we continue into a sequence here. And I've always enjoyed this, this pairing because on the right you have this man who is a biker sitting at a bar, and he kind of has a bit of like a tough demeanor. But when you really look at him, he's, you know, quite vulnerable. He has the words love tattooed on his knuckles, and paired with these flowers, I think that also maybe becomes, you know, something that we maybe all can relate to maybe a tough shell that we put on as like a protection from our own kind of, you know, vulnerability or softness. I can say I can relate to that. This photograph is of Ace. She is Miss Juneteenth at Galveston, Texas, again, the home of Juneteenth. And so this night she was the reigning Miss Juneteenth, and she was preparing to pass on the crown to the incumbent Miss Juneteenth, who would be nominated that night. And I would be missed not to say that my partner Miranda is also a photographer, a very brilliant photographer at that, and she often would, you know, be the key to getting access to some of these spaces of, you know, coming of age and young women. And she has an excellent project that she's working on herself that's in color, and so often we would be able to go into the spaces, and since the people were kind of old school, they would often kind of love that we were this young couple who just was interested in history and wanted to take pictures. And, you know, every once in a while I'd have to do some event photographs, but something like this would happen as well. And so I'm never above, like, I've shot anniversaries, I've done graduation photos, and it's all kind of a part of the same community use of photography. And so on this night, you know, I was definitely moving some chairs, I was definitely walking some grannies to the restroom, and, you know, but it's brilliant, and I love it, and it's a kind of participating in these acts as not just outsider or observer, but really being in the thick of it, helping somebody's aunt get onto Facebook Live. You know, that's a classic one. There's a lot. There's you know, so a lot of fond memories there. This is the First Baptist Church in San Marcos, Texas, really close to where I grew up, actually, in Hays County, which is the hill country of Texas. And I guess it's important to say that Texas has 5 geographic regions. So there's Gulf Coast, there's desert, there's rainforest, but there's also a rolling hill country. And so this is in the hill country. And this neighborhood is known as the Dunbar region. There was a musician here, his name was Eddie Durham, and he's kind of noted as the first electric guitar player. So he played with a type of music called big band. It's like kind of hot jazz, Cab Calloway. You think of like Kansas City swing, and it was pretty happening in the like 40s. And so he was one of the first electric guitar players, which often is known from being like later on with early rock and roll. But Eddie Durham, you know, he has a popular song known as Hit the Bottle, which, you know, it's definitely a slap, if I do say so. But this town and this church is important, and it's a pillar of a community that's not really there anymore. There's a small museum that a scholar put together, and so, you know, this church is also important because it is the second of these 2 churches. The first one was initially burnt by the Klan. This was right in the middle of a very kind of, you know, very racist area that there was very prominent Klan presence. And so the first church was burnt, and the second one was defended by a later Klan attack that in the newspaper records note there was 2,000 Klan members that the church was defended from. And so if you see the original images of this church, it was really quite a wonder, and something that you could only imagine would have been of immense pride, having such a large church in this small town at the time. But the area was built in a floodplain, and, you know, different times changing. There was pre-integration of the military, so there was a black and brown Air Force base in the town. And so again, it gets back to this idea of this kind of constant change that is happening, and why people leave might be this reason. You might go to the larger city. And so I think to just kind of blame it all simply on gentrification is an oversimplification of the issues. This next sequence, I might do a time check soon because I want to make sure that I'm good on time. Okay, so I'm going to speed it up. Okay, so these photographs were made with a poet named Roger Reeves. He did a beautiful meditation about this space in the low town of South Carolina. This what came out through Granta Journal initially. This image, as I said, speaks back to the storms in Texas. This is marks of construction in a field where homes will be built. This is a woman, she is Sherry Dupree. She's one of the historians who brought back the history of Rosewood, Florida, which I spoke about earlier, before the 90s. And also I guess it's important to say that Rosewood, Florida is the only example of American government ever paying reparations to Black or Native people. It was argued in the courts in the 90s, and before it wasn't really spoken about. It was a bit of a taboo in the community, and so Sherry Dupree was a scholar who recorded a lot of oral history of the survivors and has really been the reason that that history came back around. And John Singleton, who directed Boys in the Hood, also did a film on Rosewood, which I definitely suggest. This is also taken from Florida. So here we kind of repeat these kind of universal landscapes in the South as far as we go from Florida to Mississippi. And here we use these delta trees. This is along the Blues Highway in Clarksdale, which is popularized with kind of where Robert Johnson met the devil at the crossroads, and may or may not have sold his soul to a life of rock and roll. And we kind of repeat it with this image of this young man's locks, again, kind of showing in which a metaphor of nature, and how history, how we are, so intertwined. But also in this sequence, we use a repetition, and I'm getting here towards the end. So we use one generation. Here is the Mississippi River, so synonymous with the blues as well as American photography and the American South. This is viewed from Louisiana side. You go to the next generation. This is a cowboy in Cheek, Texas. His name is Jimmy. In this next image, you see the floorboards of a home that were burnt down, and because there was a leather shoe here that repelled the fire, you can see these footprints. And so it's kind of this way that the past and our elders and ancestors kind of walk with us. And in this image is Bessie Randall, who is 96 when I made this portrait, and she is a survivor of the Greenwood Massacre. Photographed her at her home in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I just really love this portrait of her. She was such a sweet woman, and a funny story about her is that she had a grandfather clock in her home that she had literally had from every home she ever moved to, and I just found that to be so interesting, her connection to that, and just told me something about her. And her grandson was telling me about how much of a hassle it was to move that thing a few times, but she was not gonna be in a space without it. And so our connection to spaces and, armchairs, and how if you think about an elder in your family, they might have one chair that you familiarize so much with them. And so in this pairing, we have, Sister Shirley, who became a really close friend of ours. We photographed this church for about 3 years. At one point, I was even drumming in the choir, and so would play the drums with the choir and then take pictures afterwards. And the elders in that church were really a key to unlocking the history and understanding what happened before, because so much of it was, either in scholarly documents in the university, but to really kind of get a sense of the history, it was great to meet the people there. And so this image calls back to one of the first images in the book, again, of this idea of kind of discarding of historical spaces. So we're kind of brought back after these few moments of beauty to be reminded of the churches that weren't, that weren't preserved. And these two chairs, in my opinion, should be a part of a collection. They are folk art, and they were handcrafted by people in the Cedar Keys of Florida, where Rosewood happened, and they kind of just lay completely buried in the woods inside of this building. And in this next image, you see one of the historic churches where a cowboy is just kind of riding his horse by on a summer day. And so it kind of paints this picture of, in Texas, you may just see a cowboy riding down the street. It's not completely uncommon. And this is in a neighborhood called Acres Homes in North Houston. And so I was just kind of in the right place when this cowboy passed by and snapped this photo of him. And so kind of seeing how these churches do exist within the neighborhoods. And then getting to the final of the sequence, this image in Blanco, Texas is kind of as we get to the end of the sequence. I've always loved it because it reminds me of this leisure of skipping a rock with young love, maybe a picnic, and this kind of romance that, to me, the music that I was interested in relating to this book embodies. I always say it's like this perfect point between sadness and happiness, where I think most good music, and when you think of soul music, that is both sorrowful, nostalgic, loving, there's kind of these like tangled feelings, and I think that to me that's like a place where a lot of art I'm interested in exists. And so you know, this photo to me really brings me to that feeling of perhaps a picnic, or, you know, it's just a emotion that I resonate with. And in the final image of the book, we decided to land on this photograph that is taken in Prairie View University, which is an HBCU outside of Houston. And in this photograph, kind of the choice of having it be in the last picture is that you have these 5 young people who are participating in one of the traditions that has a very long history of homecoming king and queen, the coronation of the homecoming queen. And they're all of these young people around the age of 18 to 20 who have their entire lives ahead of them. And they kind of come with all of this context of this history and this like traditions that they're participating in, but carrying on as a sign that we are still here, that the future is bright and promising. After all the hardships, after all of the kind of trials, we gonna keep on keeping on. And so that's really, they are all like kind of special to me for that. And we end here with the captions. So we kind of made the joke that it's a bit of a puzzle game to like organize which picture is which, but you can, if you're interested in a particular photograph, can find the captions here and do research into some of the towns. And then we conclude the book with an essay from Imani Perry, who is a brilliant writer. She is a Princeton University professor, also a receiver of the MacArthur Fellowship, and author, recipient of the National Best Book Award for her book, America to the South. And she wrote a brilliant essay, so eloquent and so essential to the work, that does not really describe it, but gives kind of a contextual nature of the way in which the land predates us in our own imagination, and the way in which state lines and borders are all imposed upon us. And you know, just a really great meditation on the Black and Native history of the South and of Texas, and really just so grateful to her for this contribution. And so, without further ado, thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Raheem, for this really inspiring presentation of your book. I'm really amazed by the way you are connecting your personal history with the tradition of the history of American photography, especially in the South. That's really amazing to see the way you are connecting things. That's super interesting. As we are a bit ahead of time, I think we are going to see if there is any question in the audience, and if not, I will maybe ask you 1 or 2 questions.
Good afternoon. Good to meet you, and I love your work, and I love what you spoke on tonight. I want to ask, what was one of your ways to overcome what I assume to be the intimidating task of encapsulating philosophy, history, economics, public policy and government, and racism all within photography, while knowing that this photography would not only be addressing those topics, but be breaking barriers around the world about the perception of Black Americans?
Great question. I mean, for me, it's kind of first starts off as like an act of just personal connection, you know, especially not putting too much weight on the people who are in the photographs. You know, it's like the kind of joke of like going up to someone to ask them to take a portrait, and you say, hey, I'm working on a book of documentary photographs about Texas, and they say, I'm from Louisiana, or they say I'm from, you know, so there's like so much smaller context. So I try to not overly think that part of the process, but what I'll also say is I do find an immense amount of responsibility for, as I said, photographing people's likeness. You know, I think that often sometimes in documentary there's this kind of cold reality that people say, it's like, oh, but it's subjective, and it's like, oh, it's kind of mean and pointed. And you look at a lot of photography that's like, they say, oh, but it's honest. And to me, I wasn't interested in that thing. And the metaphor I always say is like, if I saw your grandmother out or your aunt out and she looked great and I had the gall to approach her, I better make a photo that you would be okay with me showing around the world. And so I think that that's a part of the big responsibility of, you know, how do you strike that balance of not glossing over where I say, oh, wow, look at this, it's a utopia. No, that's not what I'm interested in, but I'm also not interested in something that's mean, where I say, you know what, let's get her some, somebody some shoes, or hey, you mind, like, if it's an elder, let's make sure they look good. And so, finding beauty and finding a way of striking that balance of honesty and an image that I can stand by. And I think that photographing my family first was the kind of way that I learned that. The same way that I would treat photographing one of my aunts or my grandmother who hates having their picture taken is the same way that I treat the people who I photograph and come encounter with. And then also doing it for years. Sometimes I photograph people year after year. And then to the kind of idea of the global audience of taking it outside the States. I mean, I have a photograph that shows a Shape of Texas tattoo that, when I showed it in Arles, someone was like, they had never even seen the shape of Texas. And they said, is this your Provence? Like, what's the shape here? And so, I have so much context of it from studying African American history and sociology, but this idea that people are learning about these things for the first time from my work is something that I am really inspired by and moved by, but I try not to take on an unfair responsibility where it's not the work of social worker or of legislator, but of loving artists, homie with a camera, and just keeping it calm, because I think that you can't overly think it or overly force it, but just be mindful of the history and responsibility. But yeah, thank you for your question, man. Great to have you here.
Just a curiosity, but it may have a significance. Did you stick around and see if the dresses of the two little girls got dirty after all, or?
Yes, their father called them over right as things started to get too rustling around. I mean, maybe a little bit of dirt on the knee or so, but he kept them clean. And Chase was fascinating. Their father, he was such an interesting person to work with. And we wanted to make a documentary about this neighborhood that's called Hungry Hill, because it was titled Hungry Hill because there was a group of Native people who was one of the last standouts against the government in Austin, trying to preserve a Native way of life in this area in East Austin. And they actually, the Native people, unfortunately, they ended up starving and passing away there. And so that neighborhood was called Hungry Hill, and it would later be known as the Shack because of a blues club that was there. And there's just regenerations of things. The American actor Jamie Foxx, his family has roots to that neighborhood as well. And so it's one of the last standouts, but also a lot of the people who suffer from homelessness and addiction in that neighborhood were once residents there. And it's a very, very complicated place to photograph and a very complicated place to even understand, but it was pretty critical in understanding that there was more or less a Hungry Hill in most of these towns, and that it was a kind of byproduct of the way in which we chose to move on as people. And but yeah, maybe one day there will be something with more of the photographs from that series, but that image of the two girls is from a series that I did on that neighborhood for a few weeks.
Thanks again for your work. I was just wondering, you told us about your influence. You were influenced by music, and so can you tell us a bit more how you work with it and how it shapes your work? Because we never see someone playing, or and I find it interesting the way we never see it, but we feel it through the photographs. So how do you deal with it? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, I come from a very musical family. My father was a drummer. I grew up playing instruments. That was kind of my first foray into art, was through music. So my previous book titled I Can't Stand to See You Cry takes its name from a soul ballad by a group called the Whatnots. And so I was always interested in this kind of sonics of music and the way it kind of connects to a visuality. Like you hear a song, it's when you hear a type of song that you want to put on to repeat, it's like this feeling, and then when you play it out, it's like that thing where you say, oh, I wish I could hear that song for the first time again, because it has this resonance to you. And I feel that way with a lot of soul ballads, and in particular there's a group of music that's like old 45 records, so just singles, and it might be musical groups who only put out one album. And that music was often popularized by, as I said, lowriders, which is kind of a Mexican-American tradition of Chicano car culture. And it was some of the best music to cruise to. You have these old Chevys, you have these they wear the wide leg pants, they wear the muscle shirts. There's a whole neighborhood ethics behind it of, it's just a whole culture behind just the music, and I'm super into it, I love the music. There's artists like Little Ann. She has a song called Deep Shadows, and yeah, it hits me, man. I can't hold it back. Like when I listen to that music, it's like the movie that I've never seen or I want to see, and like, you know, it's like a very like noir influence of a previous generation. But I think to just romanticize it is maybe a bit problematic. So it's maybe about kind of holding the mirror up to the past and to ourselves and reckoning why we have so many complicated feelings, and, you know, using that as a way of expressing ourselves.
Hey man, love the work, by the way, awesome. And I was really interested in your reflections on the book as you're going through it. And you have such a great knowledge of kind of like the history of American photography, and you speak about influences in your work through that. And I was wondering, does that come through the editing process of the book, or are you really going out in the field and making conscious decisions of the work of like, I'm trying to get a shot like this, or is it just like natural and instinctive in the way that you work that these influences come to you?
Yes. Yeah, great question. I would say it's kind of like a both and, you know, yes, going out with some influences in mind. I think that studying photography and having a kind of, you know, bank of images in your mind might be nice, because you might see something and have a reference points of how to respond to it. You know, you might see a lady here and you say, ah, that reminds me of this image, and there's a kind of reference point of how to render. But I think there's a thing of having your influences and then stepping away from them to kind of find your own voice within images. Also doing the first book really was helpful to learn about sequencing and making different photos, but I think also you have to do something that's unexpected as well, that sometimes might not feel good. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've made a picture and I wanted to convince myself it was good because I was like so close. And I forget whose quote it is, but there's a quote that says the difference between a good photo and a great photo is like a fraction of a centimeter, you know, and that's the reality. It might be this tiniest tinge of discomfort in someone's expression, but the outfit was good, the lighting was good, the exposure was good, and you want so badly for it to be a picture, but you gotta just keep going and just keep making photographs, and it can be very, very heartbreaking when you almost get a photo. And but also there's a history of Texas photography. There's an archive in particular that was discovered by a man named Alan Governor. It's called the TAAPA, Texas African American Picture Archive. And so that series of photographs was also a big influence. And so I was interested in how to make these photos look a bit removed from time, which became a bit of an exhausting thing to do, to always try to find these ways of making pictures that had no indication of phones. Masks were another difficult one during the height of COVID. And so, you know, it's a mixture of just trying and trying, you know. Out of this book is 70 plus images, and I believe the preliminary edit was just under like 400 images or so, and that was the same for the last book as well. So a lot of misses, a lot of cowboys and shacks, as one of my editors said. But, you know, you might just be out and you just might be out in this house, photograph it a couple times, and maybe one day it works out. And that was something that I learned, was the difference that light makes, the difference between it at this hour and this hour. And sometimes that might be the difference of 3 frames on a contact sheet in 10 minutes. And so lighting is one of the most important elements.
Before we jump to the next question and maybe the last question, I just want to add that your quotation was a quotation from Henri Cartier-Bresson, so that was perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Rahim. Thank you so much for the inspiring talk. I mean, it's one thing to take great pictures, it's another to speak about them so eloquently. So, simple question, why black and white? Because when you think about Texas and the dirty South in general, it's a very colorful place, cultures. So I'm intrigued why you choose black and white. And also, did you work in post, on your black and white, specifically for the sake of the book, the same way you would edit pictures for prints? Or did you just shoot and took the pictures out of camera and didn't touch them a single bit for the sake of the book?
Yeah. Yes, no. So everything is, except for the exception of maybe 3 or 4 photos in the book, are all film. So primarily shot with Tri-X and various cameras. I guess that's another thing of the first question about kind of what you're looking for. I think that different cameras help you respond to scenarios differently. There might be some cameras that help you to isolate a subject. There might be cameras that are more like some of the rangefinders that I use, where you need to have a bit of a exciting frame happening. You know, you can't really go in tight for a detail. And so it's kind of, you know, camera tricks at some point of how to make a scene more interesting. And as well, for the choice with black and white, you know, my first love was black and white photography. I do work in color in other series that I haven't really shared widely yet, and also in my commercial assignments. But with black and white, I've always been interested in the silver gelatin prints and also its relationship to seeing a historic photograph. So with this book being so much rooted in this idea of history and also within the archive, I mean, something that I didn't really get into, but there was a moment where, you know, because I grew up in a place called Oklahoma and also in rural Texas, and you know, having a lot of family members who kind of passed away before I was able to ask as many questions as I want, I left with a lot of burning questions of how did we get here? What is this place? Especially when you have places like this and you don't really understand what happened there before. It might just be an abandoned thing that you've passed 100 times on the road. And for me, I'm pretty inquisitive. So I would go on online archives and I would search just any keyword that about this town I would read, or newspaper clips. And it was like food for the soul to be able to learn a little bit more about this place and to have a visual record. And I think that that's something that photography can be great, because if you goes from something that's just kind of bothering you in your mind and in your heart to something where you're sharing with a group of lovely people, that's actually a form of you know, acknowledgement and healing within that. And so the archive was really important, and so the black and white photographs connected back to that history and that visual language. But also the other reason of black and white is that it allows you to mix different lighting in different scenarios very seamlessly, where color becomes its own kind of narrative tool, visual tool, where the color palette, the type of lighting becomes another element. And so working in black and white, it allows me to mix various scenes and things much more seamlessly than had you had, you know, a vehicle in the background, or if you have, you know, flash might be more difficult to mix with natural light. And so I'm interested in the task of taking on color photographs and even photographing back in some of these spaces in color, because I also think that there is something that you must be careful of with using black and white in the way in which it does place certain things into antiquity, and in particular with photographing Native American subject matter, for example. I find that color is the tool because of the dress, but also with this kind of legacy of people like Edward Curtis, who kind of wanted to place Native people in this kind of primitive state. And so, yeah, it's a conceptual, technical, and aesthetic choice that to me, I think served this work. And I'm not sure I would have been able to pull it off in the same manner in color.